Have you ever wondered how brain activity is translated into text or speech? Over a decade ago, scientists achieved a first successful decoding of brain signals. We have made a good progress since then. So today let's look at how it actually works. There are multiple efforts ongoing all over the world. There are multiple ways this brain signal can be decoded. This paper highlights one of the methods. This collection of brain signal or extraction of brain signal can be done either in invasive way or non-invasive way. So far, the evidence suggests when we try to collect the information using invasive methods, the signal is more accurate and essentially results into higher efficiency, higher accuracy. This particular paper uses same invasive techniques. Let's start with the first part. It's a good summary of what paper tried to do and what it was able to achieve. A set of electrodes is used to extract the brain signal, and then the goal is to translate that brain signal into speech at natural speech rate. There are several ways neural activity can be translated into useful information. One of them is you can translate that into some sort of motion in 2D plane, which can be used to control a virtual keyboard. The other way is neural activity can be translated into words and then finally into speech. The motion has severe limitations, as essentially you are limited to using one finger to type words. In terms of technical aspects, this paper aims to use a form of recurrent neural network called as BILSTM, bidirectional long short-term memory network. There are two paths. There is an encoder and there is a decoder. Encoder, as the name suggests, takes some input and tries to encode that in a certain format. In this case, the input is sentence length sequence of neural activity. Whenever a subject is speaking a sentence, corresponding neural activity is recorded, and the sentence is basically the label and the neural activity is the input for the encoder-decoder model. After encoder is able to successfully code this information, this neural signal, into context vectors, that information is used by decoder to translate the input into English sentences word by word. There are 4 total participants and the number might seem tiny. However, considering this is an invasive process, this experiment basically went ahead and found people who are already going through some sort of neural activity monitoring in an invasive manner. What that means is no invasive operations or procedures were performed just for the sake of conducting this experiment. So out of those 4 participants, each participant had to repeat several set of sentences. This is the first data set, around 30 to 50 sentences, and there is another data set we'll look at shortly called MOCA. It was used in 2 subsets, MOCA 1 and MOCA 2. The information again was collected using 250 electrodes distributed over this perisylvian cortex, and this region, I looked it up, is responsible for speech related activities in the brain. The metric which was used to measure the success of the whole experiment is a very common metric called as word error rate, and this operation was performed on a held out repeat dataset. The result was the word error rate was as low as 3%. One odd thing you might observe here is the held out dataset had repeat data points, meaning some data points were also present in training dataset. I have tried to explore why they were using repeat dataset. It makes sense to use repeat datasets as part of training in a way, because that would help us focus on the signal, or rather differentiate the signal from the noise which might be recorded while recording the brain activity. However, my guess is for test data, they're still using the repeat data points or repeat samples. It is likely due to the fact that this is a very complex activity. Some sort of overlap initially would help us get the technique or right technique, and then as we perfect the technique, the overlap between train and held out data set can be reduced in the future. Again, totally my guess, I'm not sure why it was repeated. Another interesting technique they have used is transfer learning in case of limited data samples. For example, 2 of the participants out of 4 had very limited data set, meaning they had spoken very few sentences which were recorded, and the corresponding neural activity was recorded. However, this experiment also explores in case of limited data set, can we use transfer learning, that is information from the same subjects on other data points, other data sets, or the information from other subjects to improve the accuracy. So in the first part, it focuses on how the previous experiments tried to explore translation of brain activity into continuous movement, which was limited, and then some experiments also explored the possibility of translating brain activity directly into speech, but in those cases the limitation was either they were looking at only simple words, or they were looking at limited number of words. If you look at this task of translating brain activity into speech, it is at core a sequence to sequence task, that is seek to seek. Now we have known for a while that for these kind of tasks we can use RNNs or variations of RNNs. For example, language translation, where input of arbitrary length is being translated into output of arbitrary length, as the length might not be the same. In this experiment also it is a very similar case. The input of arbitrary length is being translated into output of arbitrary length. So using these parallels, these researchers try to utilize techniques, advanced techniques similar to RNN. In terms of results, and this is what they found after conducting the experiment, the first data set, which had about 30 sentences, 125 total unique words compared to 100, which is a very nominal, very minor increase. But the second data set had 60 sentences and 1800 unique words. They did not use the entire data set, but they created 2 subsets out of it, MOCA 1 and MOCA 2. And again, this highlights only those sets of sentences were repeated 3 times were considered for testing. We briefly discussed earlier why that might be the case. So with respect to decoding pipeline, this is a bit of domain terminology. So these are ECOG grids which are used to collect the information of this region of the brain, and then this is the high frequency component they are trying to focus on. Now let's look at what that terminology means. The ECOG grids are basically a set of electrocorticogram. It is placed on surface of brain, so it is invasive procedure, and it helps us connect brain activity, which can be further used for multiple applications. This is the region of the brain where they're trying to focus. That region is responsible for many aspects of language processing and some cognitive functions, which also includes verbal working memory. It sort of intuitively makes sense that they're trying to capture the high frequency component. Intuitively, it should have more information compared to the low frequency component. Now, there are three key steps in terms of how the architecture is structured. Let's look at the diagram first and then start with this temporal convolution. So that's the brain. From brain, you can see these. This is a ECOG grid, the small dots. Using that, some activities, some waves are recorded. These are the waves. Then in those red colored waves here, you see a green colored filter. That filter is temporal convolution filter. Using that filter, some sort of further extraction happens. It's essentially downsampling the information into these features. You can see this green square here. Now, once we have collected these features, then our encoder-decoder architecture is applied. This input is provided to encoder, which you can see here, and the output of encoder is represented in these yellow bars. And then using the context vectors, which is the output of this encoder, we have this decoder aspect where you can see multiple words which is being produced here. There is a secondary component here which is trying to predict this MFCCs. It's done essentially so that this encoder part can perform better. So there is also auxiliary loss function associated with it. We'll see that in a bit. But that loss function, and then there is the main loss function, which is at the end of the pipeline, are two different loss function. This is more of auxiliary loss function. This would be the key loss function. So that's the pipeline. The first part again talks about the temporal convolutions. These brief filters are applied, and then that downsamples the information using a stride greater than 1. Stride, in case you're not familiar, you can think of that as a step size. Even in convolution neural networks, when we apply those two images, we have this filter which generally can have a padding of 1 and stride of 1, and we can have probably same dimension of the output. But when we have stride of 2, that means basically we'll have 2 steps at a time, the way the filter moves over the input, and that means the resulting information is essentially downsampling of the input. Then that information is provided to the encoder part. The encoder part takes this information and creates a representation. And one additional task at this stage is the researchers also guide this encoder to predict the male frequency septual coefficients, MFCCs, which essentially represents the speech in a machine understandable format. So if you want to know a bit more details, in simple terms, MFCCs represent sounds, especially from human speech, and at core they are just set of numbers representing the characteristics of audio signals. So output of this encoder is provided to decoder. The task of decoder is using this compressed information to create the actual final output. This is the final step, but before that, as I mentioned earlier, at the end of encoder step, this is where they're applying this auxiliary loss. The goal is we want to make sure the network learns to encode the information in a very efficient manner. In terms of performance, word error rate is a standard metric which they are using. If we want to understand what that means, it is a minimum number of deletions, insertions, or substitutions which are required to transform the predicted sentence into actual sentence. So if there are no deletions, insertions, or substitutions required, meaning the predicted sentence is exactly as the true sentence, then we have word error rate of 0, which is the lower bound and ideal scenario. And if we have all the words incorrectly identified or missing, then the word error rate is 100%. That's where it's capped. So we want to have it as low as possible. What they achieved was really amazing. But before that, they have provided a couple of benchmarks. So if you look here, in speech transcription tasks, the word error rate is around 5% at professional level, and then around 20 to 25% is the outer bound, meaning anything beyond that is not useful. So at least we want to achieve 20-25%. In ideal scenarios, we want to try to beat 5%, and what they claim they have done is achieved performance of 3%, that is average word error rate of 3%, which was able to beat the previous state of the art for speech decoding from neural activity. It was around 60%, which is a lot, and then it was done using smaller vocabulary, which is around 100 words. So that's the key success of this particular paper or experiment. It was able to achieve much lower word error rate on slightly larger vocabulary. In this graph, basically they have tried to understand what are the factors which are trying to add more signal, more information in this model. So this is the default model with word error rate on the y-axis equals to 3%. Instead of high density signal, if they had used low density signal, then the word error rate would have further increased around 10 to 15%. And if they had not used the auxiliary task of MFCC prediction, then it would have almost stayed the same or slightly increased. And there are few additional steps which add the signal or relevant information in the model to perform so accurately. That's the A part of the graph. On B side of the graph, it is essentially showing how transfer learning could be applied. These are the 4 participants, A, B, C, D. On y-axis you see the error rate, and then on x-axis you see the number of training samples, so the amount of data which was collected from each participant. Now for participant A, which is represented in green, and participant D, which is represented in brown, limited data was collected. What they have tried to do is see how they can apply transfer learning or information from some other places which can boost the performance, which can reduce the word error rate. So they have tried to explore 3 methods, and all 3 methods boosted the performance. The first method was different data set from same participants. So as we saw, there are MOCA 1, MOCA 2, and then they have a custom made data set. So using that, using any additional data set for a given subject improves the accuracy or reduces the word error rate. The second, I think it's here. The second thing they try to do is they try to use data from different subject and see if they can add that information. So they use information from participant B, and that decreased the word error rate by some fraction. Then for the same participant, the first thing I explained, they try to see if they have a repeat of other data set, and that decrease the word error rate by 31%. And finally they try to combine the methods, and then that decrease the word error rate by another 36%. So what is the application of this? Why in what scenarios we might need transfer learning. Let's say we started capturing these data samples from a given participants, and the condition certainly deteriorates. Um, so in case where you have limited data from a given sample or given subject, you can see if in past there was some other data collected, or we can also use data collected on similar samples, similar sentences from other subjects, and use that information to boost the performance. So that's pretty much it. That explains the paper, the outcome. At the end, they have this nice diagram of encoder-decoder architecture. Um, we should read it from left to right. So the bottom left is basically the input from the brain signal. Then the green part here is the filter, the temporal convolution which is applied. The yellow cells here are of LSTM cells. We see arrow in both directions because it's a bidirectional network. The first half here, you see here, is the encoder part. The blue outputs here are basically for auxiliary tasks. This is not the real output we are going to use. At the end of encoder, using this arrow here, the information is translated or transferred to decoder. Decoder kicks off with this information and end of sentence token. And this might be a bit confusing. This is the end of sentence token, but this is where the process starts. This information is used to create the first output token that is used as a input for the second part of the decoder. That is again producing the second output, and then that is used as an input for the next, and so on. This process continues, and this allows us to generate sequence of arbitrary length until we see EOS coming out as a output from the decoder. This is where the process stops. So that's a at very high level overview of bidirectional encoder decoder model they have tried to use. So overall, very interesting experiment. This is a bit dated now. I'm sure there are many other efforts happening. There was the recent paper by Meta where they have tried to do it in a non-invasive way, but they were not able to achieve the accuracy as these guys were able to achieve. Hopefully this continues and we have more accuracy, much lower word rate in a non-invasive manner on much larger corpus. Thank you for watching. Hopefully I'll bring another interesting video next week.